All right, good afternoon, and welcome to the session on designing identity solutions customers will love and use. This is a joint presentation by ADP and Capital One. And Capital One was founded based on the belief that data and technology would revolutionize financial services. And it's very much that belief and our execution against that every day that helped Capital One grow into one of the leading financial institutions in the U.S. in just 30 short years. Many people look at that list and notice that we're over 100 years late to the party in many cases when you compare us against our peers. But a lot of our new thinking and new focus on technology and data transformation is what has helped us grow into the financial leader that we are today. Many of you may be thinking, why is Capital One at Identiverse? This isn't a banking conference or a payments conference. It's not a conference about what's in your wallet, or is it? We at Capital One believe that identity is central to the business that we're in. And I'm very proud to be representing the part of Capital One that's responsible for making Capital One an identity vendor, providing identity solutions outside of our own applications into businesses other than our own lines of business. And last year, if you attended my session on the role that financial institutions can play in building digital identity, you would have heard about the importance of our developer exchange, where we're externalizing a lot of our APIs, and specifically 3 digital identity APIs we announced last year at Cloud Identity Summit, which in that audience was one of our first customers, ADP, which we're excited to share the journey that we were on over the past year and how we built these customer experiences so that consumers will love and use them.
Thank you, Matt. So a little bit about ADP. Let me see, how many, it's hard with this lighting, but how many of you actually know about ADP? Okay, I think a big majority. So, all right, I always like to say ADP is this big company that a lot of people don't know about. But somehow you know the name. These are a little bit of the factoids of the volume and transactions that we actually support. At the center of this is really the fact that we handle and manage a very large volume of consumer identities. My role at ADP is I lead the product team that's in charge of the identity and access management platform that supports those 32 million active users. We're growing globally. In our business, our acceleration requires that we handle north of 1.4 million registrations per month. Now, for ADP, what's interesting is we don't necessarily see ourselves as a B2C. Technically speaking, our clients are enterprises or employers, and they have employees, and the employees are end users. But really, the line between an actual consumer and an employee is blurring, and so we tend to think about our products as a consumer interaction. Now, how did we get here? This is Matt just made a reference. He and I both presented at Cloud Identity Summit in Chicago last June, and it was interesting because I did attend his session, and it was something like this, really. This is probably the best way to capture what really happened. We came together, we saw each other's presentation, we thought, wow, this is quite interesting. He's talking about something that relates to what we're doing. We really have to do something together. There was really no alcohol, I promise. And somehow a year after, here we are. And so what is interesting is really how this relationship came about. My session last year, and I really just have a footnote, but I'm just going to reuse here for you, ended with this slide. What have we learned? What has been useful in our program to transform our user experience, our security posture? One of the biggest elements of that is the user experience, and our focus around UX, all the way from research to design. And then that we had to think as practitioners in the identity space in a curve that is bending, and historically has been this trade-off of you increase security at the cost of convenience. But nowadays, we have to think about improving both at the same time. It's almost bending that curve. And that's what we need to focus and optimize for. So that was my pitch. I think that Matt and I resonated with it. And so we decided to join forces. And so you would ask, why are we partnering? What's this about? Well, it turns out we have a number of use cases If you go back to 1.4 million registrations per month, it's registration that is not just someone trying to load pictures to share with their friends. It's really a registration that matters because there are financial consequences. It could be your HR benefits, it could be your payroll, retirement services, or anything we manage on behalf of our clients. And so what we're looking for specifically is to increase the assurance in the registration process. And for us, that is 2 steps: knowing who you are, which is very important, and then making an experience seamless so that you can immediately register and have online access to our services. So we're looking, of course, to reduce any possibility of fraud. We want to increase overall assurance by partnering with banks, in particular Capital One, and benefit from bank-grade credentials. So credentials that have gone through, in many cases, a regulated process of oversight and validation. And then, of course, our fallback today for anything, if we can in any way verify an identity, we still rely on KVA. But post-Equifax, we all know this is something that needs to be eradicated. So we're in the process of getting there. Now, in addition to that, the second goal for this initiative is to improve the overall experience. So we're thinking, this is obviously something that we're going to be testing now in production, but the reality is that we expect, just from our user research, that we would improve the overall user experience at least by a factor of 2. We think that our success rates would improve by 40% at least, and that we're looking at least 90,000 or so users per month that would be going through this new experience. But what's important is how we've been approaching it. And to that, Matt, if you don't mind walking us through it.
Yeah, so over the past year, we conducted extensive user research in partnership with ADP and really built these core pillars around that are based in consumer need. So we focused on engaging consumers and understanding their perception of the user experience at every step so that we could communicate back to them in a way that simplified this very complex space. And so we use these pillars through the design as well as through the messaging in a way and with an effort towards helping build trust with our consumers in these engagements and interactions. And as data stewards and identity professionals, we very much understand as a collective body here that consumers inadvertently do things that make themselves less safe when they're interacting online. And education here is not enough to solve this problem. It takes a lot of intense research and understanding of these consumer perceptions in order to help us message and make things more transparent and clear to them as they're engaging with identity solutions. So again, a lot of emphasis on understanding these perceptions, a lot of time spent with consumers in research to hear their thoughts. And that really extended into the relationship here with ADP. When you bring 2 trusted brands together like Capital One and ADP, it was important for us to really understand how the consumer viewed this relationship and made sure that while Frank and I may think that this makes sense, we also recognize that it's more important that the consumer sees value in this relationship in order for them to want to engage with it and trust it. And so again, a lot of our research and research questions were focused on trying to understand that from the consumer lens. So together, ADP and Capital One leveraged our respective user research labs to engage Capital One and non-Capital One customers. Over the span of 8 weeks, we conducted a number of independent research studies, which we then came back together on to share insights and collaborate on how we could improve the experience. And I want to make a point: when you see the demo of the experience that will be consumer-facing or in ADP's use case, employee-facing in the very near future, we're only going to go through the happy path, but I want to point out that it was just as important that we focused on understanding consumer perception and messaging in unhappy path flows as it was, in many cases, the happy path. So we spent a lot of time on what happens when the experience breaks and how are we helping consumers get back on track. But again, 28 participants, 40 ideas generated through that process. And again, it was just a it was a great, let me go back here. It was a great collaboration between the two organizations that put user experience and trust with consumers as a high priority. So one of the key insights was, what's the angle here? What's in it for these businesses, and why are they coming together in this way? And making sure that we were messaging that clearly to consumers. Consumers understand that there's a data economy out there, and they kind of, as they see this kind of engagement, want to know what's in it for them or what the businesses are doing with their data. A lot of the consumers that we researched understood why ADP would want to outsource some of their identity verification to a bank like Capital One, and saw the value in that use case. As a lot of people understand how much this space is becoming increasingly complex and how much banks have to invest here to provide trusted identity services. And then lastly, there's a wide spectrum, as we all appreciate, of people who realize that all their data is out there and have effectively given up because they don't think that there's any chance for them of regaining control of that. And then there's the other end of the spectrum where people are highly controlling of their data and want to understand everything that's going on. And so one of the challenges in that is figuring out how to message along that spectrum to make everybody feel comfortable. We spent a lot of time testing different words that we use. Words are obviously important here in guiding and helping provide some clarity and transparency for users when they're going through these experiences. And so we tested a lot of different words to understand their perception and make sure that it was clear to them the service that we were providing. A lot of the messaging was trying to clear up that this wasn't a permanent connection between Capital One and ADP, and it was meant just to help consumers streamline their onboarding process into ADP's platform, and that it was effectively just a one-time thing and they would be able to sever that relationship if they chose to in the future. And lastly, I wanted to share a few customer verbatims about the experience, but overwhelmingly, the user research showed that consumers were very comfortable and confident with the final approach, and we had very positive feedback in the testing that we did in our labs, but now we're excited to put this into production and make it consumer-facing across ADP's U.S. employer base in the very near future so that we can actually see how real consumers interact with this and how we can continue to refine the experience going forward.
Thanks, Matt. So it's very exciting because to some extent, I get to show something that's industry first. And so I think for many of us, it's very familiar to see that you can sign into a website with any social credentials, Google, Facebook, or LinkedIn, and that's pretty much a well-known pattern that has helped a lot of applications uptake a lot of users. But for us, it's a slightly different take. Remember, we're protecting things like your paycheck, things like who is, your retirement funds, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's important that that process is well understood, that the user takes the approach of understanding what is happening. So this is our registration process. Oops, it's a little too fast. Hold on. Just going to back up. Let me set the stage. The idea here is you're a new employee that is being onboarded by your employer into our systems. To complete the process, you have to come online and give yourself an account. Now, the process starts with a registration code. Now I'm going to play the video that you enter. And once you enter, now you're presented with an option. If you pick the Capital One option, then you can authenticate with the Capital One sign-in experience, something you'll be familiar with. Perhaps you use it day in, day out, and you authorize and give consent over the data that we get. And through that, we verify and populate fields that are useful in our account setting so that we can connect you, we can notify you, we can step you up in the authentication process. And then the last step is you create an account. And that's it. Now, I'll tell you that our typical process, that what you just saw, typically takes over 3 minutes for someone to complete, and it goes through a sequence of steps where there are, in many cases, KBA questions, no out-of-wallet questions. But now we think that that process can be streamlined to about 30 seconds. And that's what we're actually releasing now. So our next steps in this journey, in this partnership, is we're going to take this that you just saw and put it out in front of clients. We're going to do A/B testing. So it will continue to inform our UX process, and we're going to get a lot of data as to how users are responding. In many cases, there are questions we haven't answered. There are hypotheses that we need to test, and we can only test them in production with real usage. So we'll go ahead and do that. And then from that, I'm pretty sure we'll have options. We'll have to increase the number of choices that we give either the employers or the end users on how they go about the registration process. And more importantly for us, this is the beginning of a journey. We want to play in an ecosystem, and that picture is supposed to mean that, an ecosystem that we want to grow. And so the intent here is, just like today, we're consuming and partnering with Capital One to help us validate identities. In the future, we see us playing that role for someone else. We also see us extending this ecosystem to allow other providers so that you as a consumer have a lot more choices that you can pick from and still reach that same level of assurance. And then, of course, once we've done that, and if we've done it well, then we'll lather, rinse, and repeat. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I have the only mic, so I can bring it around as people have questions.
Well,
For the registration, would you need to have a Capital One account?
so that is, by the way, the first question that all of our UX respondents ask. The answer is no. We're trying to make it so that you have an option. If you happen to have a Capital One account, you happen to be a customer, then you would pick that option. Otherwise, you would just go through a regular process.
What's the regular process? Like if you don't have an identity
Yes. We'll verify your identity. I mentioned that we use KVA in some cases.
to verify for Capital One system, you have to have an identity.
Correct.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, so
Correct.
the question was, going through this process, registration process, is this only available to Capital One customers? And the Capital One flow is only available to Capital One customers, but they have a non-Capital One flow as well.
Right. Metaphorically, think about when you see a website that allows you to sign in with LinkedIn, let's say. It's the same idea. You would have to have a LinkedIn account to make that work. Any more questions? There's one in the back. It's hard to see.
Yeah,
We
you
don't
can
have
take
another
this.
mic.
Yeah, I'll bring this up. I got this, Sean.
All right.
Yeah, I was just kind of wondering what was, in the partnership, what was Capital One's objective in the partnership? Because they're using you for identity proofing, basically, but what are you getting out of the partnership as well?
Yeah, sure. So our goal with this is really to meet our customers where they want to interact online and give them ways to interact in more trusted, easier to use experiences to prove who they are online. So a lot of our goal here is to just expand our customer boundaries, which we did through the launch of our Dev Exchange, and that's really the gateway that we use to extend our technology so that customers can interact in better ways on non-Capital One applications.
Yeah, so as you're looking at identity sources for both you and ADP, there's probabilistic matching that takes place. How'd you determine the threshold for probabilistic matching to decide when to present that to the customer?
I can take the first step. That's a very good question. It's part of what we're going to find out in our A/B testing is exactly how much overlap exists and where that overlap is optimal. We have hypotheses. Before we started, I think this was over drinks. This is the part that was over drinks. We talked about there is an overlap between our consumer base, but we really have hypotheses as to what that overlap really looks like. Therefore, optimizing to who sees it is still something we need to test. So we're going to do a lot of A/B testing to find out.
And just to add to that, the data that we are passing, again, which the consumer directs us to do and sees very transparently, that's just used for the purpose of matching, and then there's contact information, which we pre-fill in a subsequent form that I know the demo ran a little bit fast, but you saw on the subsequent step after the Capital One customer directed us to pass that data. So it is matching. We used the attributes largely from the NASPO ID proofing study a few years ago. And so that was the bundle effectively that we're matching together.
Right. So that's a very good point. So for us, you know, the first question our internal privacy officers and attorneys ask is, are we getting SSNs, social security numbers, date of birth, all this data from Capital One? And the reality is that we're not. This is actually a very interesting integration where we have data, they have data, and what we're agreeing to do is find a very secure and privacy-respecting way to match. And if we do have a match, there is additional data like contact info that then can come to us, and that after that match occurred. So, go ahead.
We're doing we're passing a salted hash that is being used to match.
So, a quick question for you. So, most of my experience with ADP has been through my employer, and I can't recall having created a specific individual profile. It feels like, if I remember right, that I've been onboarded as part of my onboarding process to my employer.
Sure.
So, what percentage of the business use cases are you considering here in terms of going through this process flow? Is this for every individual,
No.
or only certain B2B scenarios in which they're delegating the enrollment to the individuals themselves? Can you talk that?
Yeah,
through a
yeah,
bit?
sure. So our registration process has a number of options. The part of it that makes sense for this integration is the part where the employer has chosen to give you, as an employee, the option to register but verifying your own information. In other cases, for example, we support federated single sign-on. In that case, your employer sends us data, and we agree on how we're going to identify each other, and we have either OpenID Connect or SAML Trust, and that way you never have to register. But that gets interesting when you terminate employment. In that case, you have to become a direct access user, which is what you just saw here. There are variants of this. Obviously, SSNs don't make sense outside of the US, and so there is a complex sort of flow that would guide you depending on who you are and what your employer selected.
Anybody else?
Yep, this one. Yes, OpenID Connect.
Great. Well, we look
You
forward
got
to
it,
coming
Frank.
back next year to Identiverse to share out the actual learnings from this being in production. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.